Hello, this is a presentation of my research proposal on understanding the attributes of Indigenous women that have broken through the glass ceiling of corporate Australia. My name is Douglas Fairbanks. Discrimination against women in the workplace remains a challenge. This is despite a greater increase in workforce participation that has seen levels rise towards parity. However, this is not reflected in attainment of executive leadership and board-level positions that continue to be dominated by men. Women only account for 6% of ASX 200 CEO roles, and 34% of boards have no female directors. A recent scandal of AMP ended the career of a woman that was sexually harassed whilst the perpetrator, a male executive, was fined $500,000, then later promoted to become CEO, illustrate a culture of women being treated differently and their voices and talents silenced. Indigenous women also face the additional barrier of racial discrimination, with very few women in the higher echelons of corporate Australia. The effects of discrimination and gender bias create adverse psychological impacts, as several studies have revealed. One such study by Gong in 2009 identified that white women predominantly experience short-term psychological effects involving stress as a result of sexism, whilst black women endured longer-term harm due to racism. This impact produces lower workplace productivity, job dissatisfaction, and leads to behaviours where women would actively avoid encounters with workplace perpetrators. Psychological distress manifests itself as anxiety, depression, and PTSD. And declines in physical health all have the cumulative impact as factors in women deciding to give up in pursuing senior executive and board positions. It is not a level playing field. With this in mind, what are some of the theories that can explain the current pervasiveness of toxic workplace cultures that stifles the ambitions of women? A US Glass Ceiling Commission finding highlighted that gender bias gives rise to negative stereotyping and beliefs that influence senior decision-making processes. Gender bias can creep into recruitment selection screening at the implicit or unconscious level. For example, if women are perceived to take time out to pursue a family, it may call into question their commitment to the organisation. Career disruption affects the competitiveness of women in building up their resumes, whilst men can maintain their continuity of employment and further consolidate their skills. This calls into question the concept of meritocracy, a notion that is mainstream conviction held by most people in the industrialised world that anyone can achieve prosperity through personal merit and agency, such as ability, hard work, and determination. The Psychology of Working theory by Bluestein describes how sexism, racism, heterosexism, and ageism severely impact the opportunity of women in gaining access to fulfilling employment roles. The existing male-dominated structures reflect organisational values that do not complement family and social values, which further alienate women and their need for greater flexibility in balancing work and mother roles. In addition, social comparison theory by Festinger in 1954 suggested that people have an innate drive to evaluate themselves in comparison to their peers in terms of their attitudes, abilities, and traits. This comparison extends itself to the boardroom and the executive level, where men are more likely to hire people that reflect their own attributional qualities of male stereotypes of agency and competitiveness, upward social comparison, and negative downward social comparisons to women that are gender stereotyped as more communal and caring. All these effects reinforce the status quo of a metaphorical glass ceiling due to structural and gender bias and exemplify the challenge faced by women in overcoming inequity. Current research gaps in research literature indicate a need to acquire statistics of the composition of Indigenous women currently holding positions at the executive and board levels. It would be a useful insight to ascertain how Indigenous women in Australia have been able to surmount the current structural, racial, and gender bias barriers in succeeding in breaking the darkened glass ceiling within corporate Australia. Existing thematic narratives on Australian government websites that funnel Indigenous women into racially stereotyped and gender-conforming roles that implicitly retain the status quo are further areas that are yet to be actively explored. All this would add to the existing research knowledge base and help to better inform what factors inhibit or encourage achievement of executive and board level gender parity. In this regard, I propose a research question as to what attributes enable Indigenous women to break through the darkened glass ceiling of corporate Australia. A qualitative analysis using semi-structured interviewing would enable their voices to be heard and elicit how they overcame personal and structural barriers. Such research might provide stories of challenging the status quo, sacrifice, leadership and values. These might provide messages of psychological resilience as a protective factor for the next generation of Indigenous leaders. A thematic analysis to collectively identify overall themes of the participants can be collated and utilised to drive further potential research pathways of the qualities and characteristics that enable entry into executive leadership positions. The participants of the research would be Indigenous women that currently or previously held senior executive roles and or board positions within the private and public sectors of the Australian community. Recruitment of participants would involve a national paid advertising scheme reaching out to Indigenous women in executive roles, utilising existing mediums such as Indigenous newspapers, Indigenous business networks, and Indigenous women networks across state and territory and federal government programs. This would require development of a database to collect personal information for mail-out of a research, marketing and communications package that would state the aims and rationale for the proposed study, in addition to consent and confidentiality forms to guarantee ethical and professional discretion. The qualitative interviews would be conducted in person or via Zoom video conferencing software. Potential challenges in research in ensuring a sufficient representative sample for generalisability and the importance of obtaining Indigenous collaboration in formulation of culturally competent and sensitive questioning and to provide cultural legitimacy of the research undertaken. I hope you've been able to appreciate the importance of such a research endeavour in order to reveal what attributes and the psychological resilience that enables Indigenous women to succeed within the Australian corporate environment. Thank you.